Hi, Brian. Glad to have you again online. So today we are going to talk about what is happening in the Middle East, in Israel and the Palestinian conflict. So what is your opinion? What do your first impression of what is happening right now in Israel?
I think we see this go through cycles. Every couple of years there'll be a flare up. It's entirely politically driven. You'll see that whoever's in power, in this case it's Benjamin Netanyahu, he has all these personal political problems, with his party and the situation inside Israel. So there's a possibility that that's connected. There's also the geopolitical dimension. We often see maneuvers against Lebanon or Palestine or Israel doing strikes in places like Syria, or carrying out these covert actions against Iran, and they do all of this in coordination with the US and this wider agenda across the entire Middle East. So it could be a combination of these things. When I see this, of course I see the at face value, they're openly targeting non-military targets, and they do this on purpose. They do this deliberately to upset people and to get an emotional reaction, because you will see this many times. Israel has done this many times over the years, where they do this, they provoke this emotional response, and people are robbed of their reason, they're robbed of their strategic depth, and it makes them much easier to manipulate geopolitically. And the example I want to use just real quick was the 2011 US engineered Arab Spring. And from the very beginning, I was trying to warn people that was US engineered years before it started. And at the time, and I think you might remember some of these stories where we saw the Western media spreading rumors that, oh, Israel wants the government of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt to stay, and they're secretly shipping weapons and equipment to help save his government, and the protesters are rising up against basically an Israeli-backed regime, something like that. And people hate Israel so much, the Israeli government to be specific, that they just automatically take the opposite stance. Well, if Israel is for Hosni Mubarak, I'm against him, and I will support those protesters. And they did the same thing with Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, they said Israel was sending him weapons. And then I distinctively remember a headline where they were actually a couple of headlines where they said Israel prefers President Bashar al-Assad over the rebels, which was totally like as the years went on, it was very clear it was Israel harboring terrorists along Israeli occupied Golan Heights and carrying out airstrikes in Syria against Syrian government targets. So obviously that was very manipulative. And so the Israeli government carries out these strikes against these civilian targets, outrageous crimes against humanity, to do this, to condition people to react emotionally, and to rob them of their strategic depth of the larger picture.
So you've been following the Syrian civil war. Is it, don't you think it's maybe related to the greater plan? I mean, the greater Israel, just to expand, we've seen also some connections. The Israel is making peace with Saudi Arabia. There's actually a combination. They, together with the UAE, they took over Socotra Island, which belongs to Yemen. So don't you see maybe this plan to expand and to have a greater Israel that would encompass maybe part of Syria, Jordania, Saudi Arabia? Is it like, are we into this movement or just expanding?
Actually, that's a really good point. And if we think back to Israel's, the modern nation state of Israel, its inception, it was an Anglo-American project, and it was part of a wider strategy to divide and conquer the Middle East, to reassert first British, but then also American control over the region. And to do this, you need to divide it up. And you do that by finding ethno-religious fault lines and exploiting them, or creating them if they don't exist. And that was what Israel was part of, just plopping this very artificial thing in the middle of a very already turbulent region, and then just fueling the fire. And so, yes, the Americans probably, and the British probably promised them much more than where Israel's borders are now. But they've also promised the Turks, the Neo-Ottoman Empire, and the Saudis this greater caliphate. Yeah. And if you look on a map, you'll notice that all of these projects overlap, and that is imperialism 101. Is you promise all of these people overlapping empires that will never exist, and even if they do, they will overlap, and they will be at each other's throats, killing each other. So it's a very cynical strategy, and people think of Israel as kind of like this dark capital of this evil empire that's actually controlling the West. But actually, I believe in a lot of ways Israel is a pawn in this game. And we're going to talk about this as we go on. But actually, Angela, how do you see this? Do you think that Israel and this greater Israel, do you see like how the parallels between the Neo-Ottoman or the larger caliphate for Saudi Arabia? Do you see any parallels?
Yes, what you said just before about when the colonial powers, they retreated, and actually when they redesigned new states, it was a good way just to divide and conquer. You see, for example, Kuwait was part of Iraq, and on purpose they denied the access to the sea to Iraq, and then you see also like some countries like Iraq, they normally the Shia part was supposed to go with Iran. It didn't make sense. I mean, they did it on purpose, and those were ticking bombs. The same as what happened in India. It was just crazy to not to separate it completely. You had mixed areas of Hindus and Muslims. So then when it comes to Israel, I think it's very complex. It's very hard to understand the real project behind this. I think from the beginning, when you look at the map of Israel, you have those two stripes, and those two stripes is the Nile and the other river, and basically it was already a plan from the beginning to have an Israel which was a much greater surface. But what they've been doing, you've seen, it's they've been expanding. They have some lands. Israel has some lands that used to belong to Lebanon. It's the Bekaa, right? It's the Bekaa region, and you have some lands, the Golan Heights, that belongs to Syria. So these expansions has already started, and now you see some plans with. You see, Saudi Arabia has been doing business with Israel for a long time, but now you have some plans, combined plans between Israel and Saudi Arabia of this huge city. I don't know if you've heard, like Neom, it's this futuristic city, and which would be linked to Israel. So already slowly you have those, dictatorship of the UAE and Saudi Arabia that are already working together with Israel. And it's just a matter of time where you could imagine, some kind of merging together. But it's going to be about, like a big price to pay, because those population are extremely pro-Israel. Like if you had a democracy in Saudi Arabia right now or the UAE, they would just back Israel, Palestinian like 99%. They're victim of their dictatorship. And again, it's always about this hypocrisy of the US just backing the worst dictatorship, because there's no worse than Saudi Arabia. Just going back, I think would be just interesting just to see just this whole idea of Jewish nation, this claim of people going back to 2,000 years, and actually what are Jews? It's a taboo, Jewish and Jews, it's a taboo subject, especially for Europeans. There's this whole sense of guilt. We see lots of Holocaust movies, and they are the victims, and we should protect them, and so on. But I think I think we are in the right just to challenge a lot of things which are related to history. Jews, there are two parts in the Jewish nations. There are many nationalities within the Jewish nations. There were 12 tribes at the beginning, and there is also the Ashkenazi. They came from the Khazar Empire, And around the 10th century, those people that were in the area of the Caspian Sea, you know, in Poland and so on, and they spoke Yiddish. And around the 10th century, they converted into Judaism. So you have now Ashkenazi Jews, which they have European roots, but they claim that they have roots to Israel. And I think, you know, there's a book, interesting book by Shlomo Sand. It's a Tel Aviv professor that the name is The Invention of a Jewish Nation, Jewish People. And it challenges this whole idea. You know, you see how you have a narrative that goes back to 2000 years, but then you have at least 50% of Jews that actually don't have genetical roots to the Jewish state. You know, if you had to go back to 2000 years, you know, and I think there's a mix up, to my opinion, and I know it's a taboo, but Jews are not, it's not a race, you know, it's a religion. And in reality, in practice, tomorrow I could become Jew. I could convert technically to being Jew, even though I'm Italian. It doesn't make me, you know, it's not a race, it's a religion. It's just this manipulation. And what is interesting behind this Zionist movement is that the most extreme in Zionists are actually not necessarily practicing Judaism. So a lot of them are just like, you know, they have like how do you call it? You know, they don't practice religion. And when you look at ultra-Orthodox Jews, they're actually anti-Zionist because according to them, Jews should go back to the land of Israel only when the Messiah would come back, you know. So this minority of ultra-Orthodox Jews are the Haredi Jews. And those are Haredi Jews, you can find them in there's a huge minority in New York, but also a very big population of Haredi Jews in Iran. So you see there are lots of contradictions, but the problem is that because this sense of guilt, and especially in Europe, it's a very taboo. You cannot question, you know, whenever you question history, Jews and so on, it's very sensitive and people don't dare to talk about this, you know. So the only information we have and we can use is only from scholars that are Jews. So you see, we can actually use quotes by Noam Chomsky, by Finkelstein. We can use Shlomo Sand, who's a professor in Tel Aviv, you know, and those are brave people that are going against the mainstream narrative. So I think it's just, you know, the problem is that there's injustice. There's you see the map, you know, what was agreed. There was a vote in 1948. There was agreed a land of Israel, and it was much smaller than what it is now. So the problem is that they're taking over slowly more land. And they've been, you know, I've been following for a long time. They used to talk about the two-state solution, but it was just a lie. They never meant to have two-state solution. And if you look at the map, it's a Swiss cheese. You have small holes, you know, small holes because they're taking slowly more lands. So again, you know, I'm not against the existence of the land of Israel, but I think there's a huge injustice. There were people living there, and I wish that there would be peace and people living together in peace. You know, it's not about. I don't think it would be wise to say that Israel should not exist. Israel should exist, but again, you know, right now it's a land of apartheid. And it's a very racist project. You know, you have 20% of the population of Israel, which is Arab, and Arabs are second grade citizens. So I don't know what is your take on this. What do you think? I mean, just in terms of morality, is it morally acceptable that you have colonialism? I mean. We can call it a genocide. I mean, in some ways, it's a genocide.
I think you've done a good job kind of laying out the background of how Israel got started and this tangled, when the historical background, and when people are talking about race and religion and how it's all been mixed up. And people that follow the Israeli-Palestine conflicts, sometimes they zoom in too close and they never zoom out. But we can see that the West plays this same game all around the world. They do the same sort of thing about Tibetans, the Uyghurs in China, this whole situation in Myanmar, all of these different ethnic groups, and the Rohingya in particular. It's a very similar story where the people on both sides are having all of these historical, racial, and religious arguments. But in reality, it really is very simple. Again, Israel was a cynical imperialist project by the Anglo-Americans. They did that on purpose, but they did it already. There's people that have been born there in Israel. So just like you say, it's there, it exists. It's not going to disappear. It's very impractical for people to say we should just get rid of Israel. You can't do that. That's wrong. But at the same time, just what you pointed out, the current government running Israel, they are committing crimes against humanity. They're occupying Golan Heights. This is recognized by the UN as an occupation. They don't own that territory. That's not their territory. And what they're doing to the Palestinians is also blatantly wrong. And it's very interesting to watch the US squirm. And they don't just do it about Israel. That's a thing I want to keep touching on. They do the exact same thing about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, or things that Turkey does that are parallel to US interests. And they do the same thing with Israel. So right now, as they're killing men, women, and children, Palestinians, we had journalists asking US spokespeople, does the US condemn the killing of children? And they can't answer. They can't give a straight answer.
The Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Okay.
And this tells you something is seriously wrong. And then the Israeli government, this whole policy of theirs, creeping into Palestinian territory, ignoring the two-state solution, which would be the easiest solution to this problem, but they don't want to solve it. That's the whole thing about empire. It's about divide and conquer. It's not about people living together. It's about trying to convince people that it's impossible to live together. And I, as an American, I remember hearing the narratives floating around in the US mainstream, and they would say things like, oh, Muslims and Jews have been fighting forever, they can never get along, and this is nonsense. They have, and even to this day, there are Jewish and Muslim communities that live together. The largest group of Jews living in the Middle East right now outside of Israel live in Iran. And you will never hear the Western media talk about this or focus on this, because if they did, this whole myth that Jews and Muslims cannot get along would implode. And then we'd have to ask ourselves, why is this conflict happening in Israel? Why is Israel and Palestine fighting? If it's not religion, it must be something else. They don't want you to start looking around and asking those questions, because then it shifts from this intractable ethno-religious conflict that doesn't actually really exist, and it shifts into geopolitical questions.
Yeah, there's an interesting point from Professor Shlomo Sands. He actually says that in reality, there's a high probability that a large proportion of Palestinians might be actually Jews that were converted into Islam because of the wave of immigration. Also, back in the old days, there was an expansion of Islam. So you see, they actually people, it has nothing to do with race, because there's a high probability that Jews and Palestinians, they share the same DNA, so it is, and you see how they weaponized. I'm a bit upset about the weaponizing of the Holocaust, I think we should condemn the Holocaust. I mean, it's a terrible, it's a tragedy. But there's a very good book called The Holocaust Industry by Finkelstein, and he's actually explaining how this whole issue about Holocaust has been weaponized to justify what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. You see, and you've seen, like, they've been I mean, brainwashing us for 20 years. How many Holocaust movies we are watching, and it's always about how poor they are and so on. Of course, it's a tragedy and should never happen again. But why you are inflicting what you received, like in during the Second World War, you are inflicting exactly the same to Palestinians, and it's actually, it might be even worse because it's a slow death. It's a humiliation, and it's not lasting 4 or 5 years during the Second World War. This is lasting a generation. You have open air concentration camps. They cannot get in and out. It's just they are stuck there. The Gaza, the whole strip of the sea, they cannot go to the sea. There are only small areas where they could go to the sea, but it's controlled by Israelis. So it's open air concentration camps. But again, the problem is that the West and Western media are controlling the narrative, and they have no choice but to depict the Palestinians as being the Hamas-backed terrorists, which is not. They are, they are using the weapons, of the weak, I mean, small rockets, and you see the proportions. 10 Israeli killed, but how many Palestinians are killed? And so it's just a difficult topic. I would like to. What is your take on the ISIS connection? I mean, the role of Israel in Syria and the connection, if there is any, with ISIS. What is your take on this?
Well, first of all, about the Holocaust, I totally agree with you. This is something that people should know about. People should be educated about how it was able to happen, so that it can be prevented from happening again. And then when you try to exploit it, to do an injustice to someone else, you undermine that whole history and people's understanding of it and their sensitivity towards it. And you're actually helping ensure that it does happen again by doing that. And we remember Ukraine in 2013 and 2014, that was Western Europe and the United States supporting neo-Nazis in Europe, where the Holocaust took place, in Ukraine, where there were Nazi collaborators who helped participate in the Holocaust. So it just shows how shallow and empty the West's concern actually is about the Holocaust, the Jews who suffered, and a lot of Jews who did leave Europe and go to Israel, thinking that was going to be, a new chapter, when in fact it's like it's actually a bad sequel when you really think about what's being done to the Palestinians and how it undermines Judaism, Israel itself as a nation, because a lot of people will see this and it undermines Israel as a nation when they see these injustices take place and no one talking about. So that's a very good point. About Israel and ISIS, I mean, we remember the militants. I believe it was al-Nusra that was right on that occupied territory, the Golan Heights that Israel controls, and they were aiding and abetting al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, and al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they were all working together in Syria, backed by the US and its regional allies and its Western European allies, to fight against the government in Damascus. So whether it was direct or indirect, Israel was definitely involved in that, right alongside the US. And there were those militants that were being harbored, given safe haven, with the protection of the Israeli Defense Force, preventing Syria from wiping that group out. And it was only very later on in the conflict where Syria was able to consolidate their forces and really flush them out of that area. We remember there were ambulances transporting terrorists, And it wasn't even the Syrians that put an end to that and exposed that. It was the Druze. There were Druze in that area that were being attacked by these militants, provided sanctuary, by the Israelis. And they were the ones that actually attacked the Israeli ambulance and exposed that they were transporting these militants back and forth. So it's crazy. It's crazy about what the West tries to get people to believe about Israel and what the government in Israel is actually really doing. The disparity between the two is vast. And there's just so much work to try to get people to cross that vast canyon, between this fiction that people believe regarding the Israeli government and the reality of what they're really doing in that region. Not just to Palestine, but to all of their neighbors.
So what is your opinion about US politics, especially the hijacking of US politics? I mean, you see, congressmen, they have to pledge allegiance to Israel. I mean, at the same level, it's a pledge at the same level of the US. So, and that's a preconditions to be able just to run for politics. You have to pledge allegiance. And also this relationship with AIPAC, I mean, you have this big lobby. Every single US candidate president, they go into AIPAC and pledging for support from the AIPAC. I mean, how toxic is that for democracy? What do you think?
It's pretty bad. But again, I encourage people to kind of zoom out and look at the US as an empire, and every empire has an imperial court. And in that court, they have all of their subjects and their proxies come in, and the Israeli lobby is very significant. So it is a very significant, maybe preferential member of that court. We also have Saudi influence and lobbyists from different industries, from different countries. They all have, it's in different proportions, but they're all there in that imperial court, that lobbying pool, or maybe cesspool, that is trying to influence policymakers in Washington. But I think at the end of the day, even if you look at how influential AIPAC is, if you look at the corporations and the financial institutes on Wall Street or in London, they're so much more powerful. And it's because the Anglo-American empire, around the world wars, and now this Washington, London, Brussels international order, the Israel that exists today because of that government, that is a product of this larger modern day empire. And until we get to the root cause of that empire, symptoms like this Israeli government right now brutalizing the Palestinians and making trouble with all of its neighbors, that's going to continue. You cannot stop Israel from doing that until you get to the root of the problem in Washington, in London, in Brussels. And I think we actually already see that happening. Before we started this, you were actually telling me about how pragmatic many people in Israel are, and how a lot of them just want to do business, which that should be no surprise to anyone, because that's ordinary people everywhere around the world. They just want to work, make money, provide for their family, and have a good life. That's everybody, everywhere. And most people in Israel think the same way. However brainwashed their government tries to make them, they still want a better future. And as the global scene shifts, as US influence wanes, as multipolarism takes over, I think we're going to see that transform Israel as well. It's going to transform everything, including Israel.
So what is your take about the deal that China and Iran did? It's a massive deal. We're talking about $400 billion. So basically, China would provide technology, help building roads, infrastructure, ports, and so on, against supply of oil. And what is the position of Israel in this deal? Because, well, it's going to undermine in some ways Israel and also the US, and especially also indirectly the dollar hegemony. What is your take on this?
Well, this is exactly what where I wanted to go with this. We see Israel making friends with other Arab nations, and what this was the United States wanted to create this united pan-Arabian front against Iran, and that was the whole purpose of the 2011 U.S. engineered Arab Spring. But that didn't really work out the way they thought it would. And so now they're left with a much more difficult proposition, having a united Arab and Israeli front against Iran, which just makes it look, it's so artificial after decades of this toxic narrative that they've tried to sell about Jews and Arabs and Muslims and Jews. Now they have this Israeli Arab front against Iran, and that is really, that's not tenable either. And just like you pointed out, there was that 25-year deal between Iran and China. China wants to include Iran in its One Belt, One Road initiative. They're going to trade. They're going to do all of this cooperation in industry, in energy, even militarily, perhaps. And that, just think about it. The conflict in Syria was a proxy conflict against Iran. This was pushed by the US, and all of its regional allies took part in it. And now you have Iran still there, Syria is still there, Russia is there in Syria, and now you have China entering into the region, but in this very constructive and pragmatic way, offering infrastructure, reconstruction for nations destroyed by US military aggression. So again, as China continues to rise economically and as the US fades, we're going to watch the region transform. And I think the US, its inability to win that proxy war against Syria, or to hold on to Iraq, or any of these regions in the Middle East or North Africa that they've been meddling in, this is an indicator that their power is waning and that the landscape is going to transform. And then, of course, Israel, they're going to have to ask themselves, the people in Israel are going to have to ask themselves, do we still want to keep this government in power that has made enemies with all of our neighbors in a region that we're not going to have support from the US from? In a region where our military, which used to be quite formidable, back even as far back as 2006, their war against Lebanon, that really didn't pan out very well for the Israelis. And this goes to show that the military parity in the region is starting to even out. So what do? Do you keep pursuing this unsustainable policy of aggression against all your neighbors, or do you start thinking constructively and pragmatically and doing business with these neighbors instead of fighting them constantly? I think we're going to see a transformation. It'll be a long transformation, but I think we're going to start seeing it.
I have a tough question for you, Brian. Would you say that Israel is using the US, or is it the US that is using Israel?
Oh, without a doubt, the US is using Israel. Follow the money, add up the Israeli economy, add up the US economy, look at the defense contractors. This is something that I have people, and it's fine if people want to criticize me on this, it's fine, but they really believe that Israel runs the planet.
Yes.
The Jews are everywhere. Yeah. And I just want to remind people that human nature is the same no matter what. From person to person, human nature is the same. There is no reason why China would capitulate to some Jewish conspiracy. There's no reason for them to get on their knees if they have nuclear weapons, the largest population on the planet, plenty of resources. Why would they do that? It makes no sense. It doesn't make sense for Anglo-Americans to get on their knees to like a secretive Jewish cabal when they have, again, nuclear weapons and these giant corporations and banks. And I know what people will say, well, the banks are all run by Jews. There are Jewish people involved in banking, and there's plenty of non-Jews involved in banking. So again, it comes down to human nature. The fact that a lot of these people in power are driven by greed That's why you could see the Israeli government working with the Saudis. It's not about religion. It's about, this is how empire has always worked. About, you have your proxies, you have people in your sphere of influence. Israel is definitely in America's sphere of influence.
I could not agree more with you, really. I think it's going too far, especially this whole Jewish conspiracy. And actually, it's something that is backfiring, like in this case, sometimes when they use the term, oh, it's a conspiracy, and just to dismiss completely something that are legitimate. In this case, I agree with you. I really think that actually Israel is being used by the US to fight its war in the Middle East. It's like I see it as a big army base for better controlling the Middle East. That's how I see it. But it's going against the narrative of anti-imperialist, because, and I think it's wrong, because it's going into this. Sometimes it's a gray area, anti-Zionist and anti-Semitism, and this is dangerous. This is wrong, and maybe it can be a trap sometimes. It's like this whole fake news sometimes that they say, well, at some point they say Tripoli is working with the Israel, those type of fake news just to confuse people.
Exactly. And again, I encourage people that believe the Jewish cabal conspiracy theory. These are people that very rarely zoom out and look at from the outside in at what they're doing. They fail to see that Saudi Arabia has lobbying in the US. They fail to see people in the US, in US politics, that play the same game, but they claim that Muslims are taking over the US or the Chinese are taking over the US. This is a game that they play to manipulate public perception. This is not something rooted in actual fact. I've done the research. I've looked at what's going on. These billions that the US gives to Israel, their own defense industry makes enough money where they can sustain themselves militarily. They don't really necessarily need that money. And I honestly believe that money is used specifically to keep the Israeli political landscape locked in this irrational, aggressive stance that is contrary to Israel's own self-preservation. Think about it. I mean, like you said, it's a military base. It's like a forward operating base that you would set up in a hostile region or a region that you're trying to take over. The whole purpose of a forward operating base is to engage aggressively everything that it comes in contact with. If you think about a nation state, it's the exact opposite. They should be cooperating and working with everyone along their borders. So the whole political landscape in Israel right now with the government that's running the country at the moment is completely irrational and contrary to what a nation state would need. And if they were so powerful and that they were controlling, I've also heard like Putin in Russia, he's somehow beholden to the Jews. And actually, it's not that. It's exactly like what we were talking about before. They see the region transforming. They know that Israel is a country. It's not just the government. Same with Turkey. Turkey shot down a Russian warplane, killed Russians in Syria.
Yeah.
But why didn't Russia react? Is it because they're afraid to? No, because they're thinking long term. It's a long-term strategic decision to not overreact to that, because they know in the future the political landscape in Turkey and also Israel is going to change. It's inevitable. And if they burn bridges now, they're not going to be able to bring those nations into the fold. And it's just like Sun Tzu and The Art of War always said, you leave an exit for your enemies. You don't corner them, because if you corner them, they try to fight desperately, knowing that it's a fight to the death. And you don't want to corner an enemy like that. You always want to give them a path toward an alternative.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Serbia. It was exactly the same. I mean, China, of course, it doesn't forgive. I mean, it will not forget, but why doing something that your enemy would want you, is expecting you to do? Don't give it the satisfaction. And I think it's about waiting the proper time just to give a correct answer. and don't cut bridges, because you've seen over time, the enemies of yesterdays might become your friends of tomorrow. And in reality, if you look at Chinese, they're very pragmatic. The Chinese, they see partners, allies, as being a potential liability. They try to be neutral in general, just because, there's only national interest. At the end of the day, even the Russians, they will look first at the national interest. If the Russians are cornered, imagine, not long ago, Putin was trying to get into NATO. Ask you, if that happened, then what about China? I think they're joining together because they know that at the moment they will be stronger. So this, I think it's about just not cutting bridges and being pragmatic. Realpolitik. But at least what I try to look at is really fundamental human rights. That's how I measure the value of the values of a country and leaders. It's about facts. How many times Russia has attacked other countries in the last 50 years? How many times China has attacked countries in the last 50 years? What the leaders of China has done for its people? Those are facts. When you have the case of the US, where they are, because they have their hands on the narrative, but then it's, you see what they're saying and what they're doing is completely the opposite. So what is again, is there anything you want to add about, where it is going with Israel? Short, medium term, where is it going, this conflict?
Well, I would just like to encourage people to do more research and not fall into the trap. Israel, the government and the military do these horrible things specifically to get an emotional reaction from people. So people lose their ability to judge these things and kind of encourage this blanket hatred of all things Israel. And this works in the favor of the current regime in Israel, because what it does is, let's just say you're watching Israel brutalize the Palestinians, and you say, well, let's just wipe Israel off the map because you're so angry, you're not thinking. And when you're an Israeli in Israel, you might not even agree with what the government is doing, but you have to pick between what the government, you're the government in Israel at the moment, or these people that want to wipe the entire country off the map, which is equally irrational and inhumane. So people need to be a little more sophisticated about this. There are plenty of people in Israel that do not agree with what the government in Israel is doing right now. They're against it. You could watch RT and they'll interview people who are brainwashed and foaming at the mouth with their hatred toward Arabs. But then you will also see people interviewed who do not agree with the Israeli government is doing, or the hostilities between Israel and Palestine, and they would like to see that change. So again, this is the reason why China or Russia do not decisively, try to corner Israel right now on this issue. They know that in time, if they work hard transforming the region, they're going to get rid of all, it's like this, it's like a swamp. They're trying to drain the swamp instead of swat every single mosquito. That's what they're trying to do with Israel. And if the region is successfully transformed, where this Western influence, and I should say aggression and just outright occupation, if this is pushed out of the region and everyone is able to move forward again, Israel's going to have no choice but to transform in this new environment, or they won't survive. A mosquito cannot survive in the desert. It needs a swamp.
I think very wise words. I agree with you, really. I think we shouldn't go into this narrative of, it's not white and black. I think and people should be just careful not to fall into this like 100% anti-Israel. I think it's about how we can find solutions. And personally, I'm angry because those people, they've been living together as brothers, for 2,000 years, and it's very frustrating that you see so much hatred. I think we need to get back to some rationality, and not put oil on the fire.
Exactly.
Well, Brian, it was very nice to talk to you. Well, let's. You wanna talk about your channel, how we can follow you, how we can support you?
Okay. I have a YouTube channel, Land Destroyer. I have a blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. And if you go to either one of those, you'll probably find links to my Patreon. And again, thank you very much for doing this with me, Angelo. And let's try to make it like a weekly thing. I think that would be
Sounds
really
good.
great.
My pleasure, Brian. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you again.
You too,